Hello everyone and welcome to the channel. I'm Emmanuel, I'm a former Boeing 737 pilot, and welcome to the descent tutorial in the iFly Boeing 737 MAX. We're just about to reach our top of descent here in the next 10 nautical miles, and we are going to request our descent clearance from air traffic control. Now, if ATC offers you a clearance, such as when ready descent or on pilot discretion descent, then what we're going to do is simply to dial down the MCP altitude and nothing further. However, if ATC issues an immediate descent instruction, so if they simply say descend via the star or whatever, then we need to initiate the descent immediately. The way to do this is to dial in the lower altitude and then press the altitude intervent button. If you are within 40 nautical miles of the top of descent and altitude intervent is pressed with a lower altitude, the aircraft is going to go into the early descent mode, where it is going to descend at 1000 feet a minute until it intercepts the VNAV path and then follows that path. If the altitude is simply dialed down without pressing altitude intervent, then the aircraft is simply going to initiate the descent as it passes the top of descent that you can see down here on the VNAV page. Now, this is of course the most favorable option, since we can remain at the cruising altitude for the longest time, therefore saving the greatest amount of fuel. Now, as we're about to start our descent, let's go ahead and talk about the MCP altitude setting technique. When you are descending in VNAV and there are several altitude restrictions along your route, you basically need to set the next altitude restriction on your MCP until you are within 1 nautical mile of the waypoint and meeting the restriction is assured. When that is the case, you can dial the altitude down to the next lower waypoint. This is standard Boeing operating procedure. However, it is rather annoying if there is an arrival that has a lot of restrictions on it, like the one that we have over here, where you basically have altitude restrictions all over. As long as the aircraft is in VNAV and you set your MCP altitude down to a lower altitude, VNAV is automatically going to abide any restriction. Therefore, not official procedure, but certainly doable. You can just go ahead and set the MCP altitude just to a much lower altitude straight away. But remember, if you are changing from VNAV to any other vertical mode, such as level change or vertical speed, you lose the protection of abiding to the restrictions. So in those cases, the entire VNAV protections are going to be lost. So be very careful if you do this. As we're descending to a lower level, we might eventually start encountering some clouds, and in those cases anti-ice will be needed. So how do we use anti-ice on the descent? You will remember in the climb we only used anti-ice with a temperature in a certain range. On the descent it's different. On the descent, as long as the TAT shows less than plus 10 degrees Celsius, we are going to turn the engine anti-ice on. That means if we are entering any sort of clouds and we are descending, in other words the engines are running at a low power setting, and the temperature is 10 degrees or less, always turn the engine anti-ice on. Remember, turning it on, you first turn on the engine start switches, and then you turn on the engine anti-ice switches. That is the proper sequence. To turn it off, turn off the engine anti-ice switches, and thereafter turn off the engine start switches. Now, passing flight level 300, we are going to select the angle of bank selector back to the 25 position, so that we have full maneuvering capabilities available if we are getting radar vectored at a later point in the arrival. A good pilot is always going to monitor the flight's progress. We have several different tools available for that. A very handy tool in the Boeing 737 MAX is the vertical situation display. You can see down here that it displays the vertical flight path of the aircraft, and it also shows us the restrictions that are applicable. So in this case we see that over at Laney we are going to be just about at the very top of the altitude band that is offered to us down here. Now, as we are descending, a good pilot is always going to monitor the descent himself as well, and not just blindly going to rely on VNAV. So how are we going to do this? There is a very basic rule of thumb that we can apply to calculating our descent path, and that is per 1000 feet of altitude we need 3 nautical miles, and on top of that we need to add 1 nautical mile for every 10 knots of airspeed above 200 that we need to lose later. So let's do an easy calculation here. As we are reaching 27,000 feet, we take 27 times 3, and that is going to be 81. On top of that we need 8 miles to lose our airspeed, so we need 89 nautical miles from now to make a nice idle descent down. If we now have a look at the progress page, we can see our remaining distance is 82 miles at the moment. In other words, the aircraft is more or less on a good profile, since we have a little bit of headwind here as well. You can see right now, we did get a message that the aircraft thought that it was unable for the next altitude. If you receive messages like this, first of all question them. Don't just blindly trust the aircraft, but ask yourself, is it reasonable what the aircraft says? In many cases, it is not. Those messages on the 737, both the NG and the MAX, can be rather, let's call it, misleading. So always question those. But if you decide that you indeed need to increase your drag, there are 2 ways to do this. The preferred way is by increasing your speed. So if there is no ATC speed restriction, simply accelerate, and that is going to steepen the angle of your descent. Only if accelerating does either not help or does not bring you sufficient gain, then the speed brake would be used. If you're using the speed brake, be sure to use them smoothly and slowly. So move the lever somehow like this, and don't do this, because the speed brake is extending and retracting very quickly in the 737, and that can cause significant passenger discomfort. Now, as we are descending, we are monitoring our VNAV progress, and if you're ever wondering about, well, I need to reach a certain waypoint at a certain altitude, what kind of rate of descent do I need? There is a very good tool for that in the FMC, and that's located down here on the VNAV descent page. You can see down here, by default you see the next waypoint with the next altitude restriction, and the airplane tells you the flight path angle and the vertical speed required. But you can override this and you can enter anything. For example, if we want to know the vertical speed required to make a direct approach to the runway, we could enter runway 28 right and an altitude of, let's say, 100 feet, so 0-100. Enter that over here. And, well, seems like this does not work in the iFly at the moment, but if you do that, the airplane would calculate the exact vertical speed and flight path angle required, which can be really useful. So hopefully this is something that iFly is going to implement in a future version. Nonetheless, I want to include it in this tutorial because it is really handy to have this feature available. Throughout the descent, we are continuously monitoring the air condition and pressurization to make sure that the system is performing appropriately. And eventually we are going to reach a point where we have to turn on the fasten seatbelt sign. Now, there are 2 criteria for the fasten seatbelt sign. The first is 15 minutes to landing. The second is 15,000 feet of altitude. The one that is met first is the one that triggers the fasten seatbelt sign. So have a look down here in the progress page for your estimated landing time, which is 19:21 at the moment, and you can see the time is 19:19. In other words, it is just about time that we are going to turn on the fasten seatbelt sign over here. We're about to pass our transition altitude, so let's go ahead and select the local QNH. And again, if you forget to do that, 300 feet below the transition altitude, the FMC is going to turn the indication amber to remind you. So, set QNH, QNH 3002 cross-checked, passing 17,200 now. And that is checked. So, once again, as we are flying in an airspace where VFR traffic can be expected, let's go ahead and turn on the landing lights over here. Generally though, in North America, below 18,000 feet, you want to turn those landing lights on. In the rest of the world, you basically do it below 10,000 feet. But always remember, that is 10,000 feet above the aerodrome level. So if you're approaching an airport such as Denver, that is located at 5,000 feet elevation, then you want to run the entire 10 checks at an altitude of 15,000 feet rather than 10,000, which would translate into just 3,000 feet above the ground. So we are gaining a little bit of speed over here. We want to help our VNAV to reduce that, and it actually says drag required down here as well. So let's go ahead and pull the speed brake. And when you do that, be sure that you only pull it to the flight detent and not across that. The speed brake is not that effective on the 737 MAX, so you will have to anticipate the speed reduction early. Looking at our nav display, you can see we've got the decel point indicating over here. And this is basically the point where the aircraft tries to decelerate to the next lower speed restriction. In our case, that is the 250 knot restriction over at CDES. I will help the aircraft a little bit with the speed brake, but you can nicely monitor the deceleration on the vertical situation display. The green dot that you can see on the line down here is the point where the aircraft calculates that you are going to reach the target speed selected on your airspeed bug. So that is a very useful feature in order for reducing your airspeed. Now let's go ahead and have a little look into the future. Things will go very quickly in a few moments as we're nearing San Francisco, so I am going to start with my 10 checks now already to have sufficient time available to explain them to you. As we're passing 10,000 feet altitude, the pilot monitoring is going to call altimeters, and the pilot flying is going to respond 10,000 descending, whatever is dialed in up here, 10 checks. The 10 checks in the descent are rather similar to the 10 checks in the climb, but with a slight difference. First of all, we check the fuel, and we make sure that it is balanced, and that the required pumps are on, which in the descent are normally going to be only the main tank fuel pumps. Now, you can see there is a slight imbalance over here, but don't worry, unless the imbalance exceeds 1,000 pounds, we do not need to start balancing fuel. So only with an imbalance of 1,000 pounds or more, that is when you would start balancing. Next up, we check that the landing lights are on, and if we are flying at night, we would also turn the logo lights on. We check the air condition and pressurization, and normally at 10,000 we expect the differential pressure of about 4.0 with a descending cabin at around 350 feet a minute. Also check the pressurization mode selector is in auto, bleeds on, packs auto, and the temperatures are behaving well. The 737 is notorious for a very bad cabin temperature management, so don't be surprised there. We ensure that our fasten seatbelt sign is on, and then we move down to the MCP, where we check that the bank angle limitation has been reset to 25 degrees. We run a recall, and last but not least, we are going to deselect the emergency frequency 1 to 1.5, since that would only distract us on the landing if we start hearing meow, woof, be professional during our approach. The last thing is to disconnect from any CPDLC that you might previously have been connected to. Alright, we are now below 10,000 feet and we are nearing the approach area. From here on, you should monitor your altitude every 1,000 feet, so run those mental calculations. Passing 9,000, we need roughly 27 miles plus another 5 from here, so 32 miles. Check the progress page. We have 29 available, so we are currently coming in a little bit high. Let's go ahead and continue the descent according to the approach procedure. I'm going to go down all the way to 3,000 for our ILS interception already. So as you can see, we are currently fighting with our altitude over here, as the aircraft has a rather steep descent path. It should have told us down here as well, but this one didn't, so the airspeed is rather high at the moment. It should be at 230, it is a little bit high, for that reason my speed brake is currently extended. Now, as we are closing in, and as we are passing the intermediate approach fix, you will notice that LNAV is going to arm in white, even though it might already be active. That is not a bug, much rather this is telling you that in case of a go-around, automatic LNAV engagement will be available. So, as we're getting closer, passing 7,000, sub times 321 plus 4 for our airspeed, we need 25 miles, and we have 23 available. So we are still a little bit high on profile over here, so I'm gonna keep my speed brake extended just now. Well, unless the aircraft starts adding thrust, then of course we will put that speed brake back in. So we are closing in on our destination airport, and roughly 25 miles out, you can expect Microsoft Flight Simulator to start showing you the ILS. In the real world, you normally receive it much earlier, but welcome to Microsoft Flight Simulator. So, our target speed is already going down, and the aircraft is aiming to start to decelerate towards the approach speed. We have one more check to complete before we can start our final approach, and that is the frisk check. Now the frisk serves to confirm that we indeed have all the required nav aids set up for our approach. You can start it as soon as the ident starts showing up here. So how are we going to do the frisk? Well, it's fairly easy. Frisk stands for frequencies, which you can check on the init ref page. On the approach ref page you have your ILS frequency down here, so 110.7, and that's set on both radios, and down here, so that's set 3 times. Fix rings, runway 28 right, 10 miles and 5 miles. Then we have the idents, India Golf Whiskey Quebec, which are confirmed on the radios as well. Then we have our standby instruments, which are set, and you can enable the approach mode over here, which is pretty handy. And last but not least, we check the courses, 284, and we have 284 up here. When the frisk is completed, we can start our... When the frisk is completed, we can start our approach checklist. So, at this point, I would like to say thank you very much for watching. Hope that you enjoyed this one. Next up we're going to jump into the approach tutorial, but that is going to be for a dedicated video. Thank you very much for watching. As always, be sure to like, comment and subscribe, and if you really love what I'm doing on the channel, I would appreciate a small donation through the Buy Me Coffee link in the video description below. Thank you for watching, and see you all again on the next one.